Robert Martin was 19 years old the first time the 1st Cavalry carried him into a real fight in Vietnam, and the trouble started before the Huey was even finished with the landing. His company was going into a valley northeast of An Khe on October 10, 1965. The men called it Happy Valley, which is one of those names soldiers give a place before the place gets a chance to answer back. Martin was a private in B Company, 1st Battalion, 12th Cavalry. The battalion had only been in Vietnam a few weeks. They had trained for this kind of air assault. They had ridden helicopters. They had practiced getting off fast. They knew where to go when the skids touched. What they did not have was much experience with somebody on the ground waiting for those helicopters to come in. The first lift carried A and B companies toward the landing zone. As the Hueys came down, fire started coming off the hills around them. Not one clean direction that a young infantryman could point at and say, "There it is." The valley had high ground around it, and the men coming off those aircraft were being shot at from more than one side, while they were still trying to get their feet under them. That changes a landing in a hurry. A Huey does not stay there because the men on the ground need another minute. The pilots have another aircraft behind them, another load to move, and a machine sitting in an open landing zone is a very large thing to leave under rifle and automatic weapons fire. The infantry gets out, the helicopter gets light, and then that helicopter is gone. So, Martin stepped into his first real combat with the aircraft that brought him already leaving the problem behind with him. There was no long introduction to Vietnam. No time to stand there and decide what the whole valley looked like. A man could see the rice paddy, the rising ground, the other soldiers moving, and whatever piece of cover was close enough to matter. That was about the size of his world. And at 19, that is plenty. The 1st Battalion, 12th Cavalry, had arrived in country in September. Until then, a lot of the work had looked more like building a place to live than fighting a war. Camp Radcliffe at An Khe was still being built. Men pulled perimeter duty. They escorted convoys. They learned the routines of a new country and a new unit that was built around helicopters in a way the Army had never done on this scale before. Then came Shiny Bayonet. It was the division's first brigade-size airmobile operation against the enemy. That sounds neat when you say it from a map. On the ground, it meant young soldiers getting into groups, climbing into Hueys, flying low over paddies and trees, and then being set down in a valley where men with rifles were already watching the approaches. The first lift found that out immediately. The enemy fire from the surrounding hills did not stop the assault, but it did something just as important to the men getting off those ships. It took away the idea that the landing zone itself was a safe starting point. That is a small distinction until you have to move through one. You can train a man to get off a helicopter quickly. You can show him how to spread out, how to get away from the aircraft, how to keep from bunching up. But when rounds are already coming in, every one of those simple actions has another problem attached to it. You still have to move away from the helicopter, but now you are trying to decide whether the ground you are moving toward is any better than the ground you are leaving. You still have to keep your spacing, but now the man you are using to judge that spacing may suddenly drop or disappear behind a fold in the terrain. You still have to find the rest of your unit, except everybody is moving at once, and the aircraft noise is still hanging over the field. The men of the first lift got through it and started doing what they had come there to do. That did not mean the valley had settled down. Later lifts came in under fire too. D Company Commander John Gergulis remembered his own company taking fire as they approached the landing zone. His men passed through A Company and moved toward a ridge where enemy positions had been seen. Sniper fire started taking men. A 17-year-old soldier named Terry Wright was hit badly enough that the men around him carried him back toward the LZ. A medevac aircraft trying to get in was disabled. Artillery later struck that downed helicopter and set it on fire. That was the first day. This was what Martin and the rest of that battalion were learning in real time. The helicopter could put you almost anywhere, but once you were on the ground still made the rules. 2 days later, Martin's platoon found out how hard those rules could get. B Company was moving along a stream bed near the end of the valley. Martin's platoon was up front, pursuing the enemy. A stream bed can look like a route because it gives men a line to follow, but it can also put them below the ground on either side. The people above you can see down. You have to look up. Then, a .50 caliber machine gun opened up. The high ground around the platoon filled with enemy soldiers firing down into them. That is where the simple problem became very simple indeed. The platoon was cut off from the rest of the company. Men were wounded, and Martin was still there with them. He did not have to understand the entire operation at that point. He did not have to know what the battalion commander was seeing on a map. He had wounded men close to him, enemy fire coming from above, and people who could still shoot back. So that is what he worked with. Martin treated wounded men while the fire was still coming in. At times he covered them with his own body. Then he helped organize the men who were still able to fight into a defense strong enough to slow the attack. That sounds like a clean sequence when you put it into a sentence. It was not clean on the ground. A wounded man does not stop being a problem because somebody reached him. He has to be checked. He may have to be moved. Somebody has to watch the ground while somebody else works on him. Ammunition is being used while that is happening. The men who are still firing have to know where the others are. And all of it has to happen while the enemy still holds the advantage of higher ground. Martin had been in Vietnam less than a month. He was 19, and this was not a training lane where somebody would blow a whistle and reset the problem. The platoon fought its way back toward the B Company position. That should have been the part where the situation improved. Instead, as Martin and others came back, they found another group of Americans in trouble. Enemy soldiers were above them, firing and throwing grenades down into a vulnerable position. Martin came up behind those enemy troops. For a few seconds, the geography that had been hurting the Americans worked the other way. The men firing down toward the American position were not expecting a 19-year-old private to appear behind them. Martin fired into them and broke that immediate threat. One of the Americans in the position below was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Shoemaker, Martin's battalion commander. Morley Safer of CBS was there too, filming the operation. Safer had come to Vietnam to cover the new kind of helicopter war the 1st Cavalry represented. What he saw in Happy Valley was not the smooth version of air mobility. It was helicopters getting hit, medevacs unable to come into a hot area, young soldiers trying to hold wounded men together, and a private doing whatever the next 10 feet required. The battalion would later award Martin the Silver Star for what he did that day. The original recommendation was higher, but the medal is not really the part that explains the story. The part that explains it is that B Company still had wounded men in a hot landing zone after the fight. At 4:50 that afternoon, the company asked for medevac helicopters. They would not come in. The landing zone was too hot. Now think about that for a moment, because it connects straight back to Martin's first ride into the valley. The helicopter had been the thing that made the whole operation possible. It had carried him from An Khe into terrain the battalion could not have reached that quickly on foot. It had put hundreds of men down where commanders wanted them. It had made the army feel fast, but a helicopter could not make enemy fire disappear. When the LZ was hot enough, the machine that got you there could become the machine that could not get your wounded out. So the problem stayed on the ground. Major Joseph Balachi, the battalion executive officer, used a small H-13 helicopter to help bring wounded men out, repeatedly flying into the danger. Other aircraft were used as well. The evacuation continued into the evening. By then, Martin's first combat operation had already given him the whole lesson in a form no classroom could improve on. Going in was only half the problem. Getting men out could be harder, and the valley was not finished with the battalion yet. On October 14th, the 112th began extracting. The enemy still controlled enough of the area to make even leaving dangerous. D Company and part of C Company took heavy sniper fire during the extraction. 2 Hueys were forced down after being damaged. Men had to be transferred from those aircraft to others. Captain Gergulis later remembered both of his radio operators taking rounds into the radio packs on their backs during that extraction. A radio pack is a big, hard object carried high on a man's back. If you ever humped one of those in Vietnam, you already know how exposed it could make you feel without anybody having to explain it. In this case, the rounds actually hit the radios. The men kept moving. When the operation ended, the 1st Battalion, 12th Cavalry, had 8 men killed and 49 wounded. The enemy had not been cleaned out of Happy Valley. The battalion had learned several practical lessons it would carry into later fights, including one that sounds almost too ordinary to mention: carry more ammunition. That one matters. Before Shiny Bayonet, the men had gone out with around 120 rounds. Afterward, the battalion moved toward carrying at least 400. That is not a theory about war. That is men discovering how fast ammunition disappears when a fight lasts longer than the plan in your head. And Martin had seen exactly what that meant. On October 12th, the people still able to fire were the people holding the wounded in place. Every magazine mattered, because the wounded could not simply get up and leave when the situation got bad. There is another detail about those first days that I think veterans will recognize immediately. The battalion did not walk away from Shiny Bayonet looking polished. It walked away with corrections, more ammunition, better judgment about automatic fire, better understanding of how hard a hot LZ could shut down evacuation, better respect for the ground around a landing zone, better sense of what helicopters could do and what they could not do. That is what real first combat often looks like. Not a perfect unit proving a perfect concept. Men finding the weak points while the weak points are trying to kill them. If you were with the 1st Cavalry in those early airmobile days, or you flew infantry into landing zones where the hills were already talking before the skids touched, I would like to hear something specific from you. When the fire started during an insertion, what did you look for first when you got off the aircraft? The tree line? A ditch? Your squad leader? The man in front of you? Those details are the part that disappears first when these stories get reduced to maps and arrows. And if you want more of these Vietnam stories told from down where the men actually had to live them, subscribe. There are a lot of names in these operations that never became famous, and a lot of the practical part is still sitting in the memories of the men who were there. Robert Martin went on to serve more tours in Vietnam. He would serve with other units and build a military career far beyond Happy Valley. But in October of 1965, none of that existed yet. He was a 19-year-old private, riding into the first major airmobile combat operation his battalion had ever seen. The first lift came down with fire already reaching in from the hills. He got off because that was the job. 2 days later, in a stream bed with enemy soldiers above him and wounded men beside him, there was no helicopter close enough to solve anything. Martin treated the men he could reach, covered them, helped the ones still able to fight, and kept working his way through the ground until the immediate problem changed. By evening, the company still had wounded men waiting for aircraft that could not safely come in, and when the battalion finally left the valley, the helicopters took them out under fire too.